Did you know that fashion brands were mentioned over 664 times in rap songs in just 2018? That's kind of crazy. And it's funny because, like, as a consumer of, I've been a huge fan of rap for forever. And very big fan of fashion as well. It's like pretty much all of the content that I make.
Nice.
It's hard to look at one without really recognizing the impact of the other on it. But it's also really interesting because, like, fundamentally, rap is, at least it started as a protest art. Like, it is a form of self-expression. And with a lot of these more traditional established brands, it's hard to get more like establishment than like luxury fashion. This is what a lot of these protests are against, you know? But at the same time, like, fashion at its core has always been a protest art. It's always been a form of protest. Like, it was used in the 1960s, and the black armbands as a sign of support of the civil rights movement. There's the whole punk rock alt aesthetic. There was the hippie look it was a kickback, or not a kickback, if only they got paid. It was a pushback against, it was like anti-war sentiment, you know? Fashion has always been, or certainly had elements of like protesting and certainly of self-expression. And I don't know what is going on with my hair, but this is crazy. I'm gonna throw a hat on for this, because that's unreasonable.
Okay.
And it's funny because for most of my like formative teenage years, a lot of my childhood even, and definitely most of my adult life, I've been an avid rap listener. And I have relatively recently, probably in the last like 2 or 3 years, really got into fashion. And like, coming from both of those sides, like the way that they play together is really, really interesting to me. And so in the process of researching for this video and just like learning more about both spaces, there's a lot that I didn't know about the history that I find like super fucking fascinating, right? So rap started in the 1970s in the Bronx. It was a protest art and a form of self-expression. There was a lot going on at the time, and then it has changed a lot over the decades. It kind of started to hit mainstream in the 1990s, 2000s absolutely mainstream, to the point where like Kendrick just played at the Super Bowl. It was the Super Bowl halftime show. And it was like, the core act of it was a rap beef. Like something that went, it was within the rap community, like that was it within hip hop. Like, it's so cool that it's received like that much mainstream attention. And it's funny because the bell-bottom jeans that he wore in that Super Bowl performance became like, so many people have been walking around with those bad boys ever since, because they saw Kendrick up there like speaking his fucking truth, like, and putting it to the man, being like, hey Drake, say Drake, and then being loved for it. And then people were like, oh, I want that.
But I want it now!
That's cool. How do I do that? And you'll see rappers today walking around with like multi-million dollar outfits. Like, I think Kendrick's crown that he wore in, I think it's definitely in the cover art of Mr. Morale, but it, like, as the rap savior, it was like $3 million, something like that. Like, the amount of money put into the outfits of these artists is insane. And it's very much not where it started in rap, because like rap again started in the Bronx. It started in some of these poorer communities where they, like, everything was pass me down, hand me down. Like, it was just getting what you could wear. And it's been really interesting as I've been learning about like how it evolved with both art forms, like how it got from an area where they could barely afford the clothes that they had on their back to where you're wearing a piece that is like multiple millions of dollars on just your head, and how it makes sense with the evolution of the art form as well. Because it started in the 70s with like hand-me-downs, and then in the 80s it started to get traction, and you actually saw your first like major endorsements in the 80s. Like Run DMC had an Adidas endorsement in the 1980s, which was like groundbreaking, that had never really been done before. And Adidas being like more of a sportswear, but also like heavily shoe inspired. Like there is a strong sneaker culture in hip hop that like stayed the course all the way through. It's been really interesting and fascinating to see. But both of these art forms, both rap and fashion, are about, it's about that element of self-expression and about, there's a protest element, like a fuck you. But then there's also a strong like, hey, I'm here, I am seen. There's an identifying and a desire to be seen and loved and accepted for who you are and for speaking your truth. That's in both. That's really interesting. And so as rap is getting more and more accepted into the mainstream into the 90s with Tupac and Biggie and with NWA, there's a desire to get out of the look of, hey, I'm trapped. This has become more than just an expression, and this has become more than just a form of self-expression. It's also become a form of status. And I feel like every art kind of goes through that, right? Like creators are going through that now, where there's that element of like, oh, it's just starting, it's grassroots, right? Like it's cool to be on the inside, nobody really knows about it. And then it starts to hit the mainstream and everyone is like seeing it, and it goes through those like first waves of hate of like, nobody really understands it, everyone's talking shit. And then the artists who are in that space, and creators are very much going through this right now, want to be recognized as real artists. And so they look for signs of, hey, I am successful, I'm able to make this work. Like, look ma, I don't need a normal job, I can do this thing that I'm really fucking passionate about and make it work, right? Like, they're looking for some of those more traditional forms of acceptance. And so in the 90s, you start seeing these larger rappers, like, they're starting to flaunt wealth and showing chains and showing more expensive clothing, which is really interesting. And it's also fascinating because you see Tupac actually kind of embrace it but push against it at the same time. Like on the one hand, he's like, fuck you, bitch. Look at all the stuff that I have and own. And on the other hand, he has a very strong understanding of classism and the role that some of these symbols and icons have in that whole system. And in the 90s, we also start to see the way that sports play into the overall like hip hop and rap aesthetic as well. Basketball specifically. Michael Jordan in his absolute prime with the Bulls, and the role that jerseys and Jordans start to play in the overall hip-hop fashion aesthetic as well. I don't think the Jordans actually hit until the 2000s. Let me see. Oh wow, the Nike Jordans, known as the Nike Jordan 1, was released to the public on April 1st, 1985. Interesting, so it actually started even earlier than I thought. But by the 2000s, they had definitely caught on. It was a huge thing. Air Force Ones were a massive thing too in the 2000s. And you started to see, and Tupac did a little bit of this in the 90s, but you started to see in the 2000s like the role that rap played and music played in politics too, with artists like Kanye West going on TV and like publicly being like, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And the role that that played in establishing Kanye as someone who didn't give a fuck. And it's those kind of people that we seek to emulate. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the person who was known for not giving a fuck was able to also shift fashion in such a strong way. Granted, there are limits to that, as we have seen very recently with Kanye's blatantly anti-Semitic and just hateful bullshit that he's been spewing. And the 2010s and the early 2020s have kind of led us to where we are now, where rappers are, it seems as though in the larger cultural zeitgeist, rappers are all looking for their own unique aesthetic. And there are some weird ones out there that I do not understand at all. But that's fine. Like, they have their audience for sure. But at the end of the day, each of them is really looking for that acceptance. It's looking to express, hey, I'm here, I'm seen, this is my group, this is what I'm trying to say, this is what I believe in. Felix is over there just like knocking balls around. My cat. Huh? Because fundamentally, a brand, if done right, evokes an emotion, right? It evokes a vibe, it evokes a feeling. And one of the best ways that rappers and brands are able to really establish that is by attaching on to one or the other. you know? And there is a very strong, mutually beneficial, symbiotic relationship that can happen there. It's awesome. And while I think it's important to find your own personal style, the reason that people emulate these artists is because they stand for something that they believe in. They're able to say the thing that you are wanting to say and are finding that acceptance and that love for doing so. And I think it's a really beautiful thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that personally. Rap started in the 1970s in the Bronx. And this is a tough period of time to be in the Bronx. This is after all that has happened with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And since then, we've seen a couple of terms of presidents who were way less supportive. We're seeing the after effects of the Nixon, the Ford, and the Carter administrations, and there has just been like a lot of disinvestment in the Bronx and in urban centers more generally. But there are a lot of things going on at the time, like redlining. There's like active racial discrimination. There are a lot of these and a lack of investment in some of these more urban like city centers that are causing people to stay stuck in not only geographically, but like economically, and in terms of just the potential that you have to go out and change your life, right? And there were governmental programs to try and help fix some of these things, but those things only work as long as they are enforced. And if the people in power at the time don't care to enforce them, well, fucking sucks, I guess, to be you know? And so that leaves a lot of people stranded. So what do people do when they're stranded? They don't really have any other option. They turn to art. Like that is what makes art beautiful, right? And so in a way, it actually kind of forced this mixing pot of just creativity of Black and Latino communities in urban centers, but especially in the Bronx is where you really started to see people play around with these different sounds and these ways of expressing themselves because they had nothing else that they could do. And so people would start together with these and so people would start together at these like impromptu gatherings of just around the block, you know, like kids would hang out, people would get together and they would start just like making beats, you know? I wish I could fucking make a beat, but I can't. Do you see how pale I am? And it was a way of like spending time together but also it was like the birth of this art. And it was raw, and it was unfiltered, and it was defiant, and it was just for them. And so you see the inspiration, and really it was more out of necessity than anything else. Like the fashion of rap at that time was very like early street fashion, very much like hand-me-downs. It was whatever they could afford, like thrift store finds. There was a lot of sports and athletic gear, even in those early stages. And you're seeing a lot of clothes that like don't fit right. It's like oversized. And frankly, it's like a lot of the baggy look, it's their clothing that doesn't normally fit right, but that's what they had. And it also allowed for a lot of freedom of movement because you start to see like some of these more street style art forms like breakdancing are also starting to like be born and evolve. And hip hop as a dance form, which is something that I also love, is starting to come out just as a way of like expressing and moving to the beats and like being in a group of people that are just there to spend time with one another. And it was all about like creativity and resourcefulness and just like making what you had at the time work for you right now. And so they did. And it's been cool researching a lot of this because I found artists that I've never heard of before, right? So there were artists like DJ Kool Herc, whom I had heard of, but I never heard any of his stuff before. But there was Grandmaster Flash and Africa Bombata. And so they started to push boundaries with sound, but they also had a very unique and distinct style. Like Africa Bombata, for example, had a very strong Africana-inspired aesthetic and a lot of pride in his roots, right? That's where he drew a lot of his inspiration, and it was also an expression of, hey, I'm here, I am seen, we are worth talking about.
Stop it.
We should be proud of where we come from, right? And it was really a community-driven thing of like, hey, this is a tough time and this is a tough place, but we're here together, and we should be proud of the fact that we're here together and we're standing together as a community. And we're not ashamed of who we are and where we come from. And these people who are saying that loudly and openly, I want to be like them, I want to dress like them. And the thing is, like, you can dress well without overly nice clothes. Like, your things don't have to be new for your fits to look good, and that there is a care that goes into when this is the best piece that you have, and this is your thing, like you don't have much. I'm gonna care for this article of clothing, right? Because I found it and I'm investing in it, and this is an expression of me. I think all of this is super interesting because and I forget where the quote is from.
You can do it!
But and I'm gonna paraphrase, it was something along the lines of, if you wanna learn about fashion, learn about everything but fashion. Because fashion, like, it's about the clothes, but it's not about the clothes, right? Like, it's everything around why I wear what I wear. And I think that's really cool. That's the thing that, like, fascinates me about it, right? Like, why do we give a fuck? This is why. Moving into the 80s, rap started to, like, actually get more mainstream attention. And it started to go from this more informal, like, family gathering situation and more on a local level to, like, actually, it's kind of coming into itself, as it were. Coming into itself, a classic.
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
And this is in the backdrop of, like, there's Reagan policies, there's a strong conservative swing back to the right, and a lot of divestment from these governmental policies and organizations that normally help people in poorer, more urban environments and help communities like the Black and Latino communities. And so as all of this is going on, rap is kind of coming into itself and starting to garner some of this more national spotlight. It's really starting to take a strong stance on things. It's becoming more of a protest art, and it's becoming something that people are starting to aspire to more. And as it's getting viewed by more of, like, a general white population in the United States, it starts to also clean up a little bit in terms of the way that it's presenting from a fashion aesthetic perspective, right? Because it's starting to try to appeal to a broader audience. And frankly, in the 80s, a lot of, like, white America is scared of Black and Latino America, but they're fascinated by the art, right? And so they're listening, but only so far as it is, like, comfortable to them, right? And so you start seeing artists and groups like Run DMC who are coming out with frankly more of, like, a clean but, like, minimalist, like, not a stripped down but more of a refined look, right? And it's an evolution of streetwear because it's taking some of those essentials of streetwear, like jeans, like sneakers, like even some sports inspired wear, but it's kind of like turning them up a notch, you know, like refining them a little bit, right? You still have your Adidas sneakers, they're unlaced, right? You have dark fedoras, you have your jeans, but they're stripped down of all the, like, extra ornamentation and whatnot on them. It's a very minimalist look, but it's still distinctly streetwear. And so it's a rebellion and it's still shocking, but it's something that they are appealing to a broader audience. And then you get people like LL Cool J coming out who's just like, this man is a fucking icon. Like, he's got the bucket hats, he's got the chains. He's really leaning into that cultural pride and that identity. And he's not afraid of showing it. Like, he's like, this is where I come from, these are my people. Like, I am not scared of that. Like, it is an expression of him and self and, like, kind of putting on for the community, you know? And so he's also drawing from some of these more African traditions where it's like that he's wearing his hair longer as a sign of, like, wealth and status, right? But he's wearing it in a way that works in a more urban, modern America. And people see that. People see him taking a stand and, like, owning who he is and not being afraid of it and, like, really pushing the boundary, especially from a fashion perspective. People fucking love that. Also, the fact that he makes great art always helps. And then there are really interesting cases like rapper Dan, who I'd never heard about before until I was doing research for this video, but he started taking brands like Gucci and Louis Vuitton and, like, kind of reinterpreting them to in a way that's a lot more accessible for your average person, right? And I think this is definitely where some of the, like, the attraction to the more upper end luxury brands, like, starts. You start to see it in rap, is with rapper Dan, but he's like customizing his pieces. He's wearing, like, bootlegged fabrics. Like, it's very much he's incorporating these brands and logos, and he is customizing them and using bootlegged materials in a way that it is its own protest, right? He's combining these things together where it's almost like making a statement about, like, hey, I have made it, I have success, I'm wearing some of this iconography, and this is bootlegged, this is kind of stolen IP, I'm customizing it, it's mine. I'm not afraid of wearing, like, oh, what is the term? And I guess they wouldn't even be dupes at that point, it's literally just, like, bootlegged shit. But that's what, like, traditional established fashion brands hate, that shit. And so the fact that he was wearing them proudly and boldly it's a statement. And so in the 1980s, you also see the rise of the NBA, and that becomes huge, like athletic wear in rap and fashion in general, but rap fashion specifically. Like you really start to see it take off. The Air Jordans came out in the 80s. The Air Jordan 1s were 1984, I think. And the Nike Air Force 1s also came out during that period. The Air Jordans are really interesting because Nike actually picked up Michael Jordan like early in his career, like before he was the star that he became. Because really, like, the 90s were when he like really popped off, but like for a shoe like the Air Jordan to get made, that's like a couple years long process. So for like early mid 80s for it to come out, like they picked him up early. That investment paid the fuck off. That's crazy. But it's cool also because that's like, you see a younger performer, entertainer, like a young black man, like make it early, right? And he made it. Basketball definitely became a large source of inspiration for rap and rappers. Like there's that ongoing joke about how hoopers always want to be rappers and rappers always want to be hoopers, but like this is where it started, right? And so it's really interesting looking back on, and this is something that I learned a lot about while researching this video. Like it's now rap is, it's very commercial. It's like people are spending so much fucking money on these outfits, and fashion is very commercial just kind of inherently. But rap fashion in the 80s started very clean, very practical, and with people like rapper Dan, it was like a very intentional statement of like against established fashion brands, right? But again, money doesn't necessarily mean a fit is good, right? You can have a really expensive outfit that looks like ass.
Shit. Got your ass.
Or you can have a very cheap outfit that if the pieces work together, like you take care of them, you pick good pieces, like you can have a very cheap outfit look really good. And I think this is the latter, right? Where the focus was on kind of minimalist things, going back to your roots. Obviously LL Cool J was roots, yes, but the chains and whatnot less so. But people like rapper Dan, like incorporating like fakes and ripoffs of some of these established brands as a statement. It's really interesting. And groups like Run DMC, where it was a very clean aesthetic, very minimal, it wasn't overly flashy. That's also a statement. So the 70s were the birth, the 80s were the maturation, the 90s were when it got like it mainstream, right? And 90s were also when you got like gangster rap, which is fucking phenomenal. Love it. During that period of time also, that was the Clinton administration. You started to see reinvestment into some of these. And so while America was prospering, a lot of these inner cities were really still struggling, and there was a lot of gang violence. And one thing I forgot to mention before was towards the end of the 80s was the start of the crack epidemic, and the crack epidemic ran through the early 90s. And so even though the United States is some of the most prosperous it's ever been, like the Soviet Union fell at the end of the 80s, the US is the only superpower in the world in the beginning of the 90s. We're seeing like record-breaking wealth generation. The inner cities and a lot of these communities, a lot of these Black and Latino communities are not seeing any of that. And so there's a big rise in crime because people frankly are poor. Like they can't afford this, right? They can't afford to live. And so that gangster rap is kind of birthed out of that, right? Because how do governments typically respond to crime? Well, they typically just crack down on it fucking harder. And so there's a lot of undercurrents of like, there's like a lot of police brutality that's going on. And there's a lot of poverty and just like, frankly, a lot of hopelessness, right? And so as rap has even entered a lot of the mainstream recognition, a lot of the people in the communities where rap was birthed are still stuck in a lot of those same situations and have a lot of the same feelings. Except that now the ceiling is much higher for the people who are able to make it. And so you start seeing a lot of like aspirational things. Rappers are starting to wear a lot more aspirational brands, a lot more expensive brands, because for the few rappers who are able to make it out, they can make a lot of money. And they have the success and they're able to, and there's still that element of like wanting to prove that you made it, right? Especially in white America that like sees rap as like, oh, what is this thing, right? Like I don't understand this art form. What are they complaining about? What do you mean police brutality? And so on the one hand, there's like, you have your baggy jeans and your oversized tees and your sneakers, like the things that were kind of, not the uniform, but what were being worn before as a statement of like, hey, this is where I come from, this is the streets, this is really all that we have access to, frankly. This is kind of the culture, like I can dance, I can move in these, I can play sports in these, I can play basketball in this. But then there's also that element of, oh, for those of us, the rappers who have made it big, who have the kind of money, let me flaunt it. Let me get big gold chains. Let me get expensive jewelry. Let me get these flashy things, right? Because I've made it. And I need to show people that I've made it, right? Because the up until this point, baggy has never really, anything in the larger like cultural zeitgeist, right? Like most of America is like, baggy, they don't wear baggy, right? They're wearing tighter fitting clothes. People who are like successful and have a lot of money are wearing like tailored suits that fit them perfectly, right? Like if you're wearing baggy clothes that are falling off of you, it's because in the eyes of America at the time, it's because you can't afford anything better, right? You can't afford anything that fits. And so these things continue to be their own form of protest. And sports are like a huge thing at this point. Michael Jordan is in his fucking prime in the 90s. And very much like rap, sports are also seen as one of the few ways that you can kind of get out of poverty, get out of the inner city. So it's a very aspirational thing. And so incorporating things from rappers and from athletes into the fashion of the time, right? And so the 90s actually saw the rise of some dedicated hip hop fashion brands that we hadn't really seen before, right? And that was kind of coming out of the need to, and the desire to express yourself more and really acknowledging the fact that like, hey, this is popular, people care about this, people are wearing this, let's lean into it. So it's interesting because brands like Cross Colors actually came out of men wearing baggier jeans, baggier clothing, but that shit falls off, right? And so Cross Colors actually came out of, okay, we need to tailor this, we need to make sure these things actually fit on you well, so you can wear these baggier silhouettes, but they're not like falling off of you, right? And so that started to kind of redefine urban fashion in the sense of like, these were actually being made for a very specific aesthetic. Like they were being customized to fit. It was no longer a necessity thing. If I'm paying to have something tailored, right? I'm buying this clothing this way. There is more money there. It's a choice. There's an intentional choosing made then, right? These clothes were made for the streets, right? That's literally like what made for the streets. And it was designed to celebrate that identity and that pride in these communities that have frankly have long been marginalized. Bandanas were also a big thing too, especially in like gang culture. That is its own symbol of identity. And so you started to see bandanas also get woven into what the fashion looked like at the time. I have changed.
Wow.
And hopefully my hair will cooperate better, but if not, the cap it is. So the early 2000s were an interesting period, right? This is when I started like hearing rap. I was born in 99, so really anything before that was just like, it was just before my time. But this was the end of the Clinton administration and then the beginning of the Bush administration, which is a really interesting time, especially in the United States. 9/11 happens early on in the 2000s and there's a lot of xenophobia, strong patriotism, and anything seen as like non-American or like pushing against America is met with like heavy criticism and scrutiny, right? Also, in the early 2000s, you get the dot-com bubble. And so you start the millennia off with a lot of poverty, a lot of like political turmoil, a lot of like, it's the first time that the United States has been attacked on its soil in like over half a century too. There's a lot of just like general unease and panic, like it's a crazy time. I cannot believe I forgot to mention breakdancing in the 1990s. Oh my God, breakdancing was such an important part of it. And so, I think I need a hat.
It's okay, birdie.
Whatever, it's not perfect, but it's gonna have to do. But basically you have this 90s aesthetic that is very baggy, a lot of freedom of movement, great for things like hip hop and breakdancing that need that extra motion, that range of motion, and also kind of benefit from the like bagginess and the fluidity of the clothing because it adds just that extra element of flow to your moves, right? But in the new year, in the new millennia, rap is fully mainstream. America is changing. And you start to see rap take on elements of like very American things. It starts becoming a lot more commercial. You start getting a lot more entrepreneurial ventures and you start actually seeing especially in the early 2000s, rappers are actually starting to come out with some of their own brands. And so as rap is becoming more commercial, it's reaching for some of like the status that comes with those luxury brand names. and some of that aesthetic too. And so you start getting people like the Diddler. He launches his brand Sean John in the early 2000s, and it does really well. And what it does is it blends streetwear with more traditional aesthetics, like just higher fashion looks. It's really beginning to, Sean John was really looking to blend the aesthetics of rap and of hip hop and of streetwear with some of those higher fashion aesthetics, and it did it really well. Frankly, it fueled a lot of other shit that we have recently found out about, but what are you gonna do? Sportswear is still playing a really big role, especially basketball, in like hip hop fashion aesthetic. And I think it's around this time that the Air Force Ones become so popular that they kind of become a meme, which is also really interesting because it's during this period of time that the internet starts taking off in a like social way. These are when you start to see your first like social media platforms, and so people are able to communicate different thoughts and ideas very like significantly more easily with people they've never met before. I think MySpace was really the first big one that was launching during this period of time. Fucking bro, throw back to MySpace. That's crazy. I never had a MySpace. I have only seen video of what it looked like during that period of time, and like looking back from 2025 on like technology of the early 2000s it's astonishing to me that people were able to use that shit. It's crazy. The other thing that MySpace, yeah, I can't believe they were doing that. But the interesting thing that MySpace allowed for that had never really been seen before was a relationship with your fans as an artist that was dissociated from geography. And so you could have a fandom all over the nation of people who were interested in what you were doing. They wanted to keep up with you and keep in touch with you. But they lived all around the United States. And so it just accelerated and really amplified the ability of some of these larger artists to be able to spread not only their music and their ideology, for lack of a better term, their words, their message but also their look and the vibe and the feeling that was associated with that look, right? This period in the mainstream was associated with like practicality, but definitely that aspiration too. There was a lot of experimentation, a lot of blending, and there were those practical streetwear garments, but then really starting to heavily incorporate a lot more of that like luxury look into that aspirational element into their looks. And this is also streetwear, because before this, streetwear was very much seen as like, it wasn't accepted in the mainstream in the same way that it is now. Like now it's a staple of fashion. Like you can't go anywhere without like streetwear is a thing. It's very established, right? In the 90s, it didn't have that like acceptance. 2000s, it starts to get there, right? It starts to get that widespread acceptance, but there is still an authenticity to it. You don't have like the wagon riders, the riders as it were, who are hopping on because they're just trying to embrace these, like, you don't really yet have the people who are hopping on because it's trendy. It's still kind of in that pre-trendy stage, but it's getting there. In the mid to late 2000s, I would be remiss if I did not talk about Jay-Z and Kanye West, and especially Kanye and the impact that he had on fashion, and especially fashion within rap. Because Jay-Z definitely had that like aspirational aesthetic, definitely like the combination of streetwear, a lot more streetwear, and then he had chains and like very like outward luxury, demonstrating outward luxury. But Kanye was different in that he didn't give a fuck, which has served him well up until somewhat recently. Not great. But two, Kanye didn't come from, like, he came from a pretty good background, all things considered, especially compared to a lot of other rappers. Like, he didn't grow up super poor. His mom wanted him to go to college. Like, he had more of an established, safer background, and he brought that intellectualism with him, and that was reflected in his fashion too. Like, he had a very distinctly preppy look, and it was something that especially rap fashion had never seen before. And so when he was combining some of those streetwear and like more luxury aesthetic looks, he had a very distinct look. It was a lot more preppy, and it definitely pushed the boundaries of what people were comfortable with within the protest art that is rap. I mean, obviously at this point, rap is more than a protest art, but he was visually pushing the boundaries of the thing that had been up to this point visually pushing the boundaries. And Kanye actually launched, he had a small brand called Pastel, which frankly, it was just like it was a tee with like his face on it, and it flopped. Like nobody bought it, nobody really wanted it. But he was like starting to lay the seeds of what would eventually become Yeezy.
Easy peasy lemon squeezy.
Jay-Z, on the other hand, he definitely was a fashion icon. I think he's definitely more of a business icon than anything else, and that was reflected in his fashion too, right? Because he had streetwear elements to what he would wear, but Jay-Z would also wear a lot of like tailored suits and like really nice, what you would consider to be traditionally like luxury clothing. Pharrell Williams also was coming up during this period of time, and he launched his brand, Billionaire Boys Club, early 2000s, or mid 2000s, let me see. And Pharrell is really interesting because he is also one who's not afraid to go against the grain, but he does so in like a more subtle, quiet way. Like he doesn't really talk that much about it, he just lets it speak on its own. And so he was doing streetwear aesthetics, but with a little bit of like a futuristic element to it, and so like playing with textures and more like avant-garde ways. It was very interesting. Yes! And Pharrell did it in a way that kind of let the art speak for itself. And so it was very different in the sense of like Kanye is very loud and heard. Pharrell's very quiet and lets it kind of like sit and challenges things in his own unique, like letting it speak for itself kind of way. And during this period is when you started getting platforms like Facebook, Tumblr was really big. I think Pinterest launched during this period of time. I could be wrong, but when it comes to like looking at fashion, hard to beat Pinterest, aside from potentially Instagram. But Instagram didn't launch until later. And so you started getting boards of people who were like coming together and like really talking about these different aesthetics, and we're coming together. And so you started getting these communities of people who were coming together for fashion or for rap, and they were really basing their looks around a lot of these tastemakers who were in the hip hop scene. And at this point, it's pretty common for fashion houses is probably an overly large term, but like fashion brands and brands in general to start partnering with a lot of these rappers. Kanye actually had a partnership with Nike before he had his partnership with Adidas that became Yeezy. And it's during this period of time that rappers also really start like name dropping brands. It starts here in the like mid to late 2000s, but in the 2010s, it's like it goes off the fucking rocker. The 2010s are a wild time. Let's see. Obama was elected, so that's great. And then subsequently Trump got elected, so not great. But it's a wild time in terms of, this is when social media gets like mass adopted. This is also when streaming platforms start getting like mass adopted, and people are able to listen to music basically instantaneously, and they're able to watch anything they want to pretty much at any point in time. It's a crazy period, and I loved it. And this is also when you start getting the rise of like content creators and early influencers. Vine was huge. Tyler, the Creator, was on Vine. That's a crazy tidbit I didn't know for a while. I found him later through his music, and a friend introduced me to some videos of his because he's fucking hilarious. But this is when you're able to start getting some of those like niche subcultures of people who were just like able to find community on the internet, and it's awesome. Like I said before, Tyler, the Creator and Odd Future are coming up during this period of time, and it's very much and this is like when I was probably like 13 or 14 or so. This is when I started discovering a lot more of these artists and these creators. Tyler and Odd Future, and Tyler especially, was very contrarian, like very brash. He was just himself. He didn't give a fuck. And that was like, for me as a younger kid growing up, I was like, I saw that and I was like, I want that. He was able to say the things that I didn't know I wanted to say, and he was hilarious about it, you know? And his fashion choices were likewise a lot more playful. Childish is a little bit diminutive, but like bright colors, very bombastic, the logos and iconography are all intentionally imperfect, really leaning into being not abrasive but contrarian. Like they were just different and unique and relatable, and it was just a bunch of kids like having fun, making music, skating, like just having a good time. Skate culture was huge around this time, so was parkour, but parkour is crazy. And you see it integrate into the fashion zeitgeist at large for sure during the 2010s. Lil Wayne is probably like the best example of a rapper who just also loved and embraced skate culture. Pharrell Williams too, actually, is a good point. And so during this period of time, streetwear is like changing and refining, and it's starting to get its different pockets and niches and subcultures, and it's become this thing that has subcategories underneath it, largely as a result of hip-hop and the influence that rap has over the United States, but the world at large at this point. And none of that would have been possible to the degree that it was without the advent of social media and being able to share things and being able to listen to things whenever you want to, and being like the ability of something to go viral for being different to a very specific group of people was super important to some of the popularization and the popularity of a lot of these cultures and to a lot of these fashion movements. It was a cool time to grow up for sure. In a lot of ways, the development of the internet for me personally kind of reflected my own development as a person. It kind of went through its infancy when I went through my infancy, and then it really started to like come into its own and be different and change and stuff. Kind of with me as I was going through a lot of those things, like with puberty and just with like my own identity and just like growing and becoming a person. And now it feels like the internet is a lot more established. Things are trying to figure themselves out. There's pretty much all business is done online now. And it's cool because I'm also at that stage in my life where I'm like, I am a lot more established as a person. I'm working on my business, and pretty much all of that is done online, but still being able to just connect with people and find those communities and find inspiration and still be able to change and grow. Still at that period in my life where I'm able to change and grow, as is the internet. And during this period of time, you also started to get like fashion influencers. Like this is when you started to get your first fashion bloggers, and what started as bloggers eventually like evolved into fashion influencers, fashion creators. Me. But it like these people who were tastemakers, who were accessible to everyone, and that was their thing, is they were tastemakers in the fashion space, or they commented on the fashion space, and they had opinions about it that everyone could see and give feedback on. Now in the 2020s, fashion and rap are in really interesting places. Both of them, it seems, are... There's a unique search for identity that seems to be going on right now, in that, and granted, this may just be like, I'm not a part of some of these subcultures, and so I don't understand them, right? But with a lot of some of the newer rappers that are coming up, and especially like mumble rap, for lack of a better term, describes a lot of them, and they're coming up and they're looking for a way to stand out. It feels almost as though it is their own form of merch, where you're able to kind of support these creators through like buying into their looks. And we are in such a video and visual driven culture now, especially with TikTok, but Instagram for sure, YouTube, that having a distinct aesthetic and a distinct look is important. It matters a lot for, especially as an artist, for your work to get disseminated to people and to be shared with people. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, merch is a huge thing now, as a way to support your creators. Your favorite creators, be that podcasters, YouTubers, Instagram creators, TikTokers. And it feels like, I could be wrong, it feels like with a lot of these newer rappers who are coming up, who are developing some of these more avant-garde There's like somewhat strange aesthetics to me personally, but you're starting to see a lot of these, the rappers who are coming up now are playing around with other different aesthetics. Like people are mixing punk and streetwear, which is really interesting. The mix of tight and baggy it's really interesting to me because I'm like, like on the one hand, people love to hate on skinny jeans, and then on the other hand, people will wear like skinny jeans with like baggy jackets or like other looks, which I think is really interesting. Playboi Carti and Lil Uzi Vert will wear those. I mean, Lil Yachty he's just killing it fashion-wise. But at the end of the day, I think it's really interesting it was a really interesting exercise and experience for me to go and learn more about the history of both rap and fashion's development as a direct result of rap. Because not everything that a popular rapper wears catches on, right? But the things that do catch on, why do they catch on? They catch on because we as the audience like what it represents. Rappers are artists who express themselves. Like they don't have a fear of expression, right? And that's something where we are in our own way when we're making similar choices and we see a creator or an artist that we really like and we're like, oh, I'm getting their aesthetic. Like we want what they have. We want that feeling. We want that acceptance. We want that expression of like, hey, I'm here. I exist. I resonate with what you said. I loved what you said. I accept you for you. I want to be loved and accepted in that same way.